Good day, badly bumbling yet budding badass bikers. I'm Unsilent, and not every game can go down in history as iconic. For every legendary game, there are myriad others that coast by as average. The focus of this video is certainly not average. Today, let's look back at a famous, or is it infamous, game from gaming history. It's the classic, the iconic, the legendary Ride to Hell Retribution. Hello, and welcome to the Retrospective, a series in which I look at the great and sometimes not so great in video games. Today we look at a game that is often considered among the worst games ever made. For gamers back in 2013, Ride to Hell Retribution was a landmark moment in gaming. Not since Big Rig's over-the-road racing did a game have such a universal consensus. While 2013 was a banner year for gaming with the likes of The Last of Us, Grand Theft Auto V, BioShock Infinite, Papers, Please, and Gone Home, for every action, there is an equal yet opposite reaction. So if The Last of Us, the big winner at the end of the year, was the action, the equal yet opposite reaction was Ride to Hell Retribution. It may not have always been like this, though. Ride to Hell wasn't always the abject horror that was unleashed on the world in 2013. In fact, it was envisioned completely differently when first unveiled in 2008. Originally called just Ride to Hell, the game was supposed to be an open-world game that would allow you to use a variety of cars and motorcycles as you go through late 1960s California on a 95 square kilometer map. Almost 80 square kilometers bigger than Grand Theft Auto 4's map, a game that was released in 2008, and still 20 kilometers larger than Grand Theft Auto 5's map, a game that released 3 months after Ride to Hell Retribution in 2013. Producer Marin Gazzari referred to the setting as sex, drugs, and rock and roll, a phrase worth keeping in mind as we get to the final release. The game was far enough into development that the dialogue for the original iteration of Ride to Hell was recorded, and cutscenes were motion captured. It wasn't all just sizzle reel and carefully orchestrated promotional articles either. There was also some pre-alpha gameplay footage that made its way to the internet in early 2009. Sure, it looks a little choppy, but you can see how the game looks more Grand Theft Auto inspired in its gameplay and visual design. What is shown looks relatively generic, but if the devs were able to find a unique spin on the genre with their 60s California sex, drugs, and rock and roll setting, they could have had a winner. Of course, we didn't get that version of Ride to Hell. After being debuted at E3 2008, it was supposed to release in 2009. However, along the way, lead developer Deep Silver Vienna ran into trouble. Deep Silver Vienna was founded from the remnants of Rockstar Vienna in 2007. The studio was put to work on the Nintendo Wii horror game Cursed Mountain. The title turned out to be quite apt, as while the game had mixed success critically, it was a commercial flop. Industry reporting blamed a lack of marketing support as to why the game didn't sell at launch. Cursed Mountain was released in August 2009 with a PC port released the following February, only for the studio to be closed the week before the PC launch. Interestingly, early reports suggested that Ride to Hell wasn't cancelled with the closure of Deep Silver Vienna. The former Gamasutra, now known as game developer, reported that Ride to Hell would be moved to Deep Silver's Munich studio to complete development and launch the game with a revised release window of 2011. Obviously, that window was missed as well, because other than some developer shuffling, news on Ride to Hell was completely quiet for over 4 years following a January 2009 press blitz. All was not lost for Ride to Hell, though. Deep Silver Vienna was working alongside the British developer Eutechnyx, a reasonably well-known racing game developer, who took up the task of actually completing the project following the Austrian studio's demise. Eutechnyx had started life as Zeppelin Games before being bought by the American company Merit Studios, who dubbed their new acquisition Merit Studios Europe. The original company's leadership then bought back control from Merit Studios and rechristened their new company Eutechnyx in 1996. At the time of Ride to Hell Retribution's release, the company actually hadn't developed anything that wasn't a racing game since becoming Eutechnyx. That last non-racing game was the point-and-click adventure game Bud Tucker in Double Trouble, made when the company was still under the Merit Studios umbrella. To make things easier on you Technics, at some point after the January 2009 press splits hyping the game and its then upcoming release, the scope and the style of Ride to Hell was retooled. According to unverified comments on Reddit and YouTube, the changes were made at the behest of publisher Deep Silver. The open world environment and sandbox elements were removed from the game. Deep Silver also seemingly split the original into 3 different games. The flagship, and the first to be released in the new Ride to Hell universe, was Ride to Hell Retribution, a standard action-adventure third-person shooter game scheduled to release in June 2013. In addition to Retribution, Deep Silver also announced Ride to Hell Route 666, which was to be a tactical road combat game that would be a downloadable title on the PlayStation Network, Xbox Live Arcade, and Steam that would also be published in June 2013. The final piece of the Ride to Hell triumvirate was Ride to Hell Beatdown, a mobile game that Deep Silver only described as a rock and roll brawler. Whatever that means. From the moment you start Ride to Hell Retribution, it makes a bad impression. The introduction is a mix of cutscene and gameplay segments as the game starts in medias res of sorts. You go from a cutscene of bike riding to a random turret section that includes your character taking intermittent pauses to celebrate while getting shot at, before cutting off abruptly. The next bike scene leads into a quick time event fist fight, which is probably your best indication of the gameplay that is to come. The intro then closes out with some more cutscenes of bike riding, your character executing someone, and ending with a jump over a helicopter, which isn't nearly as cool as the helicopter jump in Tony Hawk's Underground. Of course, almost the instant your bike lands, you cut to a loading screen, which kind of also diminishes the coolness. As the game starts properly, you're met with a tagline saying 10 days earlier. Instead of starting with a fast-paced combination of a tutorial and hype segment, the game starts off in a confusing, poorly planned and programmed section that might give you a teaser of the action to come, but in doing so also spoils part of the game. Well, assuming that you could keep up with it because of the random jumping back and forth. For example, that Colt fellow that gets executed is a member of the villainous Devil's Hand biker gang who you meet in a story segment within the first 15 minutes of the game. So you aren't even a half hour into the game, and you know Colt will meet his end via an execution at your hand. Granted, it's not like Retribution has a particularly complex plot. You play as Jake Conway, a Vietnam veteran returning to America and trying to reacclimate to his new surroundings while possibly dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, as implied by a brief flashback to the war at the very start of the game, and some post-coital chat about the war about a third of the way through the game. I'll come back to this in a bit. This is in line with the original Ride to Hell, which features a player character with the same backstory. The differences come quickly as the original Ride to Hell sees you join the Devil's Hand biker gang as a result of struggling to reacclimate to civilian life after the war. After joining the Devil's Hand, you were to complete a number of varied tasks as you rise the ranks to become the leader. In Retribution, the Devil's Hand are the antagonists. After Jake's whiny brother is seen by the Devil's Hand wearing the colors of the Retribution biker gang and finding out who Jake and whiny brother's father is, they shoot Jake and cut his brother's throat. Thus starts your standard cliched revenge tour as Jake looks to take down the Devil's Hand one by one. So you wonder, if it's just a generic, bland, paint-by-the-numbers story, why is this game so poorly regarded? As you can likely tell by how much of the video remains, so very, very much went wrong with this game to make it famously infamous in gaming. Let's start with the characters. Our protagonists are all incredibly stupid. Whiny Brother has been running around town in Retribution colors, and only when Jake comes home does it happen to be a problem with the local Devil's Hand biker gang. Their uncle knows that Whiny Bro is posing as a tough biker and wearing enemy colors in Devil's Hand territory, while knowing full well that it's a catastrophically bad idea. Shall we just jump straight to story spoilers? Not that anyone cares, but if you really want to play this for the story, it's your own damn fault for wanting to play this game. The leader of the Devil's Hand, Caesar, which isn't too on the nose, hates Jake's father because he lost a race for his then-girlfriend, who ended up becoming Jake and Brother's mother. He was so angry over losing fair and square that he left Retribution and started his own gang, the Devil's Hand. Then when Pops Conway reneged on a second bet for more or less ownership of Jake's mother, Caesar murdered them both. Not to mention that Whiny Bro was also dating Caesar's strange daughter. That would have been an awkward time meeting the parents. "Hi, I'm Caesar. I murdered your father after he abandoned you to your not actually Uncle Mac because he bet your mother in a race and welched on the bet." Of course, Jake's plans to exact vengeance are often incredibly ridiculous in a convoluted, padded out for a video game sort of way. For example, his idea to get back at the biker who slit Whiny Bro's throat is to go to the underground fight club where said biker is the champion and run the gauntlet until he can fight the guy for the underground fighting championship of the world. Now, Jake could have just jumped the guy or accosted him outside the club, but he had to battle his way up the ladder in fights to the death. Then there's Jake's attempt to get into Colt's Ranch, which was protected by an electrified fence. Across the street was a truck stop. So naturally, Jake killed a bunch of truckers, stole a fuel tanker, drove it to the local power plant while killing a bunch of cops, killed a bunch of power company workers, and then shot the tanker to blow it and the power plant up to kill the power to the electric fence. I would have stolen the truck to run the fence, but whatever. Slowly but surely, Jake grinds through the repetitive cycle of motorcycle driving, quick time event beat-em-ups, shooting galleries, and quick time event boss battles before finally confronting Caesar. Okay, there are alleged plot twists beyond the aforementioned. Not actually Uncle Mac was murdered. Is it really a plot twist if mentor figures get killed off repeatedly in modern media? Hell, Star Wars does it once per trilogy. Maybe every Ride to Hell game was supposed to do that too, so they were like poetry. I guess that means there are no plot twists. It's just extract your retribution by killing every Devil's Hand member you happen upon until you reach the boss. I'm not sure what Deep Silver Vienna intended with their planned, quote, film-style production model, end quote. But I don't think Eutechnics and company followed through with that on the story. At least most of the key players in the Devil's Hand meet appropriately ironic deaths. They had a tendency to be hoisted on their own petard when meeting their maker. It's not just our protagonists who are idiots, though. The villains are idiots, too. There's a standing order for the Devil's Hand to kill Jake and family, but didn't recognize Whiny Bro's Retribution gang vest nor his father's name on the front of it until just now. Our underground fighting biker friend claims that Jake won his matches without honor, immediately after stabbing a random guy in the back. Caesar also thought Mac, Jake, and Bro went into hiding when Mac operates literally the only garage in town that has his damn name on it. Jake's plan to get to a Devil's Hand higher up is to infiltrate the Devil's Hand by running errands for the guy, which wouldn't have been an issue if the gang weren't out to kill him on sight, and if Jake had attempted a disguise instead of continuing to wear his Retribution vest, and if Jake didn't give the guy's girlfriend his real name. Okay, the ineptitude goes both ways on that one, actually. To make matters worse, the voice acting is bland at best and offensively bad at worst. Some of that is down to the acting. Maybe don't hand the lead role to someone whose only IMDb credit is this game. He's far from the only one, as a skim through the cast on IMDb shows most actors as having one role, or this being their first video game acting role, or just their first acting gig altogether. You can go through this game and try and piece together where the budget went, but it clearly didn't go to the voice actors.
Oh, Suki. Oh, wow.
Jake? What the hell happened?
You don't know the half of it.
And it's compounded by the fact that the writer of this game has only this game to his credit as well. For something that was originally supposed to be a prominent game in their catalog, and then was supposed to launch a whole franchise, Deep Silver really didn't try to put their best foot forward. I mean, did they even read the script before it entered production?
You know how to move, Tony. This is like a skinny little old baby cow, ain't it? You ever slice an ear off of a baby cow? They scream and scream. It's funny.
So while the game's overarching plot isn't too much worse than subpar, it's the detail and the acting and the dialogue that drags it from approaching mediocrity to hellish. If this was the absolute bottom of the game in terms of quality, it still might almost be passable. Of course, it wouldn't be infamous in that case. As mentioned earlier, the gameplay can be broken down into a few core elements. There's cover-based shooting, fist-fighting, quick-time events, and bike riding. One has to wonder if the intention was to throw a few different types of gameplay at you so you'd have the width of an ocean and the depth of a puddle when it comes to actually playing Ride to Hell. As you spend most of this motorcycle gang-focused game on your feet, it makes the most sense to start there. Shooting is reasonably straightforward. Aim and fire. If only it was that easy. The problem with the gunplay is that the game has incredible mouse acceleration. Normally that's not something I notice, but Ride to Hell has it in abundance. Top fuel dragsters have less acceleration than your mouse. You will routinely overshoot your intended aim every time you so much as tap your mouse. Maybe it's better on the consoles or using a controller, but aiming using the mouse is absolutely dire. Typically, the best way to dispatch enemies is by nailing the old headshot. However, it's never quite that simple in this game. First, enemies have impressively unnaturally quick reactions to you targeting them behind cover, so when you get them in your crosshairs, they very quickly duck out of the way. It's like the world's most aggravating game of whack-a-mole. It's bad enough precision targeting is nearly impossible due to the mouse acceleration, but they had to add superhuman reflexes on top. Adding insult to a lack of injury is the tough grunt enemies wearing goalie masks. Now, the goalie mask, developed by Greg Harrison and Dave Dryden and first worn competitively by Montreal Canadiens goalie Jacques Plante in 1959, a part of our Canadian heritage, is a piece of fiberglass designed to protect a goalie's face from a hockey puck. So naturally, it stands to reason that if a goalie is protected from a 6-ounce piece of frozen rubber hitting him in the face at 100 miles per hour, then it would also protect a biker gang tough from a half-ounce piece of metal shot out of a firearm at over 700 miles per hour. Therefore, you can't headshot the goalie mask guys. Instead, they must be turned into Swiss cheese if you were to defeat them, and even then it's a close call. Hand-to-hand combat is relatively straightforward. Quite clearly inspired by 2009's Batman Arkham Asylum, fisticuffs is simplified down to punch, block, and kick. Punch is a punch, or weapon shot. Block can also be used to counterattack if the game allows it, and kick is used to break blocks. Other than getting through a block, it does very little damage to the enemy, but it will stunlock them well enough that you can keep easily kicking them to death. It'll just take forever to do so. The seemingly most effective tool in your arsenal is the counterattack. An enemy's attack will be foretold by a big yellow spacebar over their head, which tells you to hammer the block button so you can block and counterattack. That'll give you a small opening to resume hammering punch or kick. There are also combos, but if it doesn't include the block break button, it's not worth a damn. I used 3 combos all game, haphazardly hammering the punch button, going punch kick punch, and punch kick kick. Not a deep system. You can also activate a sort of rage state. Push the button, Jake gurrs menacingly, raises and lowers his fist, and begins a quick-time event. This, like most QTEs in the game, follow the same pattern. 1 button push, followed by mashing a button to fill a meter, and ending with a finishing blow after a 3rd button push. I don't know if it's a good thing or not, but you don't know what button is going to be the required buttons each time you enter a QTE. It keeps you on your toes that way. And the animations will switch up depending on which weapon you're using, though some are exceedingly violent, and that's even for a game where the main character's whiny brother had his throat slit in the first 15 minutes. Motorcycle riding is really no better. The bike feels floaty, more like it's hovering above the ground than with any actual rubber meeting the road. Maneuvering is more a guessing game since you don't know how much traction your bike will have at any given time. Generally, it feels like the front tire will never break traction and the ass end of the bike will never stay in line. It leads to many unintentional tank slappers and power slides as you navigate the roads surrounding the town of Dead End. If one was to hit one of the obstacles in the road, the game just resets you a little ways back. There's no reversing the bike or visible damage or even a crash animation. It's just hit an object, fade to black, reset down the road a few hundred meters back. The irony of this is that Eutechnyx is a racing game developer. They've done official games for major racing series such as Formula 1, NASCAR, The 24 Hours of Law, and Ferrari Challenge, along with licensed tie-ins for James Bond, The Fast and the Furious, Hot Wheels, Pimp My Ride, Cartoon Network, and TNN. It's not like they don't have experience. It's just that they seldom made above average games, but at least they have experience making racing games. But all that experience was clearly for naught when it came to the driving model of Ride to Hell. And despite their work with customizing vehicles in other games, I was underwhelmed by that aspect of this game. Sure, there are plenty of options for customizing a bike, but don't expect a coherent paint scheme. Basically, if you want a game that's better at motorcycle riding and customizing, go with 2004's American Chopper. It's literally better than Ride to Hell in every aspect. That's not me doing a bit for hyperbole, that's the actual truth. To break up the bad driving is the bad everything else on a bike. You can avoid obstacles on your bike by power sliding it. Well, the game calls it that. You can slide your bike on its side for about as long as you want before running into a solid object. You lose no speed. All that you lose is the ability to turn, so that if you line it up right, you could slide for miles. And there's also bike combat that comes in the two flavors that this game likes the most: gunplay and quick time events. The QTEs are the ones you deal with the most. As you drive along, you lose control of your bike as the game drifts toward the middle of the road. Another bike pulls up alongside, and you mash the button on the screen until you fill up the bar at the bottom of the screen, causing the enemy combatant's bike to veer off to the side and explode. If you're lucky, it'll go mostly forward and explode after hitting nothing, as opposed to veering off the road and exploding after hitting a wooden guardrail. The shooting sees you enter bullet time, so you can shoot another bike that's way too far off in the distance for you to see if you're actually doing damage until the rider dies and his bike explodes. I don't know what the tactical road combat in Ride to Hell Route 666 was supposed to be, but there's no way it could have been less tactical or interesting than this. And yes, your bike can also veer off to the right and explode. However, it happens after your bike resets too many times in quick succession. You won't explode immediately upon hitting a solid object. No, the game resets the bike, drives it to the right, then explodes. Then there's the air quotes rewards. Okay, the game has achievements and hidden items for you to find along the way. I'm not talking about unlocking items or cash, ammo, and narcotics drops. Yes, enemies drop drugs for you to sell for more money, which really isn't that out of place. In fact, I think it would fit thematically with the originally intended Ride to Hell, having you run a biker gang, so it would make sense for a gang to have drug dealing as part of its revenue-generating operations. No, I'm talking about the inexplicable and gratuitous sex scenes scattered through the game. Now, it's not that sex scenes in entertainment media don't work for reasons beyond titillation. In fact, it works in video games for reasons beyond that too. Though I struggle to justify it as much as in movies and TV. Maybe I can give it that much credit in Mass Effect 3. Maybe. But the point is that sex in video games can work with the characters and the story. In Ride to Hell Retribution, on the other hand, it does not work at all in any way, shape, or form. You will on occasion come across a damsel in distress. There will be a woman, most often a prostitute, who is being harassed or assaulted by a man or group of men. Naturally, you, her knight in blood-soaked, tattered, dirty leather and denim armor, come to her rescue. She rewards your heroism by riding you like a horse. From being sexually assaulted or about to be sexually assaulted to a consensual affair with a random passerby. And it's usually a jump cut from fisticuffs to defender to a ridiculous sex scene, which is giving it credit since everybody is clearly fully clothed, so it's really just juvenile dry humping to a post-coital jump back to you standing where you ended the fight. Basically, apart from 2 or 3 female characters, there isn't a woman in the game who Jake doesn't drop everything to bone down with after saving. They're treated as glorified achievements rather than a meaningful part of the game. While it's a needless and frankly a misogynistic inclusion in the game, we can take some solace in the fact that Eutechnics put so little effort into these scenes that the animations and camera cuts start repeating themselves on the 3rd or 4th one. And that said, they put enough effort to include jiggle physics in the scenes, so some effort was included. I guess the budget had to go somewhere. Going through all the generally poorly designed gameplay, it would be easy to forget that this wasn't just what they decided would make for a good game that turned out to be bad, but the execution was poor as well. For all the issues noted previously, and there are obviously myriad, there are also a whole host of bugs and glitches in the game too. It's not unusual for an enemy to explode for no reason, or for enemies, be it on motorcycles or on foot, just to float up in the air. And when explosives are thrown, they have what you think would be an area of effect ring around them, but that area of effect seems to be actually about a good 30 feet instead of 3 feet. More realistic, yes, however, it doesn't match what's on screen. The game doesn't give any feedback of doing damage unless blood spurts in the air off an enemy, and that can be difficult to see from miles away or when an enemy is behind cover. Also, solid walls aren't always solid. Cover is mostly a suggestion, and when you try to use soft cover, the game can fight you on being able to aim and fire, so you're just standing exposed, unable to fight back unless you get into hard cover, which is ducked behind a chest-high wall, or run into the open. All of these would be less painful if the checkpoints were at about once or twice the level, so every death sets you back a long way. There are plenty of dramatic moments and post-boss fight cutscenes that require you to hit quick time event prompts. The problem is that the game hides the prompts at the bottom of the screen underneath the black letterboxing. At least the game takes a dramatic pause when you have to hit the button so you don't fail when you don't know what button to push, and just hit everything under the sun. That said, even if you could guess at what button it is that you're supposed to push, it may not be right. See that icon that looks like a left mouse button push? Nope, spacebar. I don't get it either, but that's what it was. These aren't the only issues with the camera that exist. Despite the third-person shooter being the genre that's existed in some form or another for 2 decades before the release of Ride to Hell, Eutechnyx's camera team didn't spend much time playing them. So the camera had a tendency to swing around haphazardly in the middle of fistfights and get caught on and blocked by the scenery in the middle of shootouts. Want to climb some stairs? Get ready for some impressive stuttering as the camera jumps from step to step. When you're on a bike, the camera can start getting a mind of its own. When it wants you to chase or follow someone, it'll focus on that guy, which can cause it to pivot away from the road in front of you, so expect to crash and fall too far behind in those sections. One complaint I had about the game early on that I haven't seen repeated by any of the critics is the frequency of the loading screens. After each segment of a level or mission or cutscene, you're presented with a load screen. When you transition between areas or from a bike to on foot, you're presented with a load screen. They aren't lengthy, which makes me wonder why they couldn't have been hidden behind a cutscene. I realized that the open world concept had been abandoned, but it's not like hidden load screens weren't common at this point in time. It wouldn't have had to be much. Jake getting on and starting his bike or braking and hopping off it would have been more than sufficient to cover these load screens. Of course, it could be worse. Some transitions aren't covered with load screens, but just a black screen. It leaves you with the hope that the game has crashed, but it's really only just a failed attempt to jump cut to a different scene. Now, there is a chance that you're looking at this game and thinking that the game looks dated. That's not because it's 9 years old. It looked bad in 2013 too. In fact, it looks worse than the pre-alpha footage from 2009 that I showed earlier. No one has ever really looked into why this slightly exaggerated art style was chosen. It could have worked if it wasn't so damned ridiculous while the story tries to play it straight. All the animations look peculiar, movement looks stiff, while lip syncing is all over the place, but still somehow not in sync with the dialogue. The colors are comically oversaturated without going for a similarly comically exaggerated world design aesthetic. I'd call it a design choice, but it's barely that. YouTuber DX played around with the game's INI file and found that a few tweaks to the bloom, depth of field, FOV, and color saturation completely overhauls the game's look. It goes from this weird cartoony, but not going all the way aesthetic, to something that wouldn't have been out of place in 2013. For all the game's problems, I'm not sure if it's laziness or incompetence that resulted in a graphics overhaul that you could do in a glorified text file. He was even able to fix some of the issues with the bike handling too. It doesn't fix all the problems with Ride to Hell, but it gets it from Ride to Hell Retribution 1% to something like Ride to Hell Retribution 20%. It's still horrible, but it isn't the stuff of nightmares at that point. Despite the uninspired graphics, there are a lot of interesting locations. The actual look of it on screen isn't often spectacular, but there are some decently designed locations. The hub town of Dead End has some interesting looking spots. Shame you can't go near most of them, let alone in them. Jake's Revenge Tour sees him riding along a variety of different roads and visiting a bunch of different one-off towns and buildings. It begs the question, who just builds a whole knockoff Las Vegas complete with multiple casino interiors for 2 missions and about an hour of gameplay at most? There's a modern mansion that looks like something you'd buy in another game. There's a bar, fight clubs, strip clubs, breweries, and more that you just pop into for less than 15 minutes before leaving forever. All these areas would seem to play off the idea that the game started life as an open-world sandbox style of game. No, games having different levels isn't unusual, even when you consider that these areas just exist for a couple of minutes of fighting sandwiched between some cutscenes. When you trace the history of the game's development and see what open-world games do with similar locations, you can see the potential left on the table, and what shortcuts seem to have been taken to give Ride to Hell the appearance of some depth. Then again, that's what they did with the gameplay too. It sure seems like Eutechnics took all of the completed or near-completed parts of the original iteration of Ride to Hell and jammed it all together until something resembling a game popped out the other side. While I mentioned all of the voice acting issues earlier in the video, the rest of the game's audio doesn't fare any better. The sound effects are incredibly low impact. It makes you question where they bought their sound effects from. Sound effects are one of those aspects of a game that you never really notice until they're awful because there's so much else that's happening in a game that you probably shouldn't notice them. Of course, with all of the other issues in the game, that the sound effects tended to escape notice shouldn't be surprising. What didn't escape notice was the soundtrack. During the media blitz for the original iteration of Ride to Hell, it was promoted as having over 300 licensed songs. That actually wouldn't have been an outlandish number, considering Grand Theft Auto 4 was in that neighborhood with its licensed soundtrack. However, Retribution has a licensed soundtrack of 1 song. That would be the main menu and opening montage song, Pressure and Time, by Rival Sons. The sound of it actually fits pretty well with the game. The remainder of the soundtrack was original music made for this game. It's all just generic guitar music that you've heard in the background of this video. I was going to call it rockish music, but it lacks the personality to achieve that description. I was hoping for something exciting enough to at least get described as generic biddle music, but we couldn't even get to that. Playing through Ride to Hell Retribution has been a once-in-a-lifetime experience. At least you hope it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience, but considering the pantheon of putrid games, you know that won't be the case. That being said, Retribution is that rare game where you struggle to find even one redeeming quality about it. It's not even so bad that it's good levels of bad, because it always finds its way back to causing misery. The terrible writing and terrible voice acting have but fleeting moments of fun before Jake opens his mouth and you hate yourself for playing this game. The actual gameplay has myriad issues, but there's seldom a bug to make you laugh out loud, so it's just painfully bad mechanics that you're forced to slog through. The graphics find a way to be so bad that they're nearly harmful to look at. Maybe the real redeeming quality is the short load screens when I played. I mean, someone okayed this game to go out the door in this state. That person is actually Ride to Hell's final boss. Suffice to say, the critics didn't think too differently of the game than I did. It was nearly universally panned as the worst game ever made. The aggregated review scores saw the game average out into the teens. Some scores were as low as 5%, though Multiplayer.it and Cheat Code Central both scored the game in the 40% range, showing that there's no accounting for taste. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Ride to Hell has gone down in history as being up there, or maybe down there is more appropriate, with big rigs over-the-road racing as the 1 and 1A of the worst video games of all time. Personally, I'd give the number 1 slot to Ride to Hell. Because while big rigs had no collision detection, no sound, no AI pre-patch, and crashed after just one race every time you opened the game, at least the driving was much better than I expected given everything else that went wrong. There's no redeeming quality about Ride to Hell. Sure, you can laugh at how bad it is, but even that is tempered by having to slog through the horrible gameplay to get to the sub-B movie writing and acting. Earlier on, I mentioned that Retribution was supposed to be the first of a Ride to Hell franchise trilogy. Retribution was released at the end of June 2013, and the second Ride to Hell game was supposed to follow shortly. Ride to Hell Route 666 was announced to be released in June 2013 as well. My research couldn't find an actual release date, just June as the release window. That was being developed by Black Forest Games, the successor to Spellbound Entertainment, whose catalog of games have landed in the 50 to mid-70% range in aggregated review scores. Would Route 666 have landed in the same spot? At the very least, it's hard to see how it wouldn't have scored better with critics than Retribution. However, Black Forest Games and their Route 666 never got the chance to see how it would fare. Deep Silver very quietly cancelled the release of the game, and it has been nowhere to be seen since. The cancellation of the game was so quiet that I wasn't able to find any announcement of when or why the game was cancelled. That said, it's easy to assume that the why is because of the reception to Retribution likely casting a very dark shadow over every other planned Ride to Hell franchise game. So we'll never know if Retribution was the low point of gaming or just the low point of gaming in June 2013. And while the Ride to Hell universe may have died, all its creators kept going. Recently, Black Forest Games has been working with THQ Nordic on remakes and remasters of older games. Though not officially reported as closed, Eutechnyx has gone quiet since losing the NASCAR game license following the release of NASCAR 15. Their website is blank, their social media has gone quiet, there's no news of upcoming games anywhere. I should note they did release one non-racing game post-Ride to Hell, that was 2014's Warhammer 40k Storm of Vengeance, a real-time strategy game released on Windows, Android, and iOS. It fared better with critics than Retribution, managing a Metacritic average of 33% on PC, which is double what they scored for Ride to Hell. Progress! As for publisher Deep Silver, they've managed to avoid the depths that they sank to with Ride to Hell. They continue to publish games that are generally in the above average to very good range, though they have yet to pick up a Game of the Year nomination at the Game Awards. So they're doing well enough to get by, but they have yet to set the gaming world alight. Well, apart from Ride to Hell, for obvious reasons. And that will do it for this episode of the Retrospective. Have you ever had the fortune, or is it misfortune, to play Ride to Hell Retribution? Leave some of your memories in the comments down below. And while you're on your way to the comments, hit that like button. Subscribe if you're new, or if you're looking for more in-depth looks at classic and occasionally not so classic video games. Though, I think we've probably bottomed out at this point when it comes to looking at shitty games. Share on social media, follow on social media. The social media handle is Unsilent On Air, and that is for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr. And don't forget that there are plenty more looks at the iconic games of old in the playlists. They're on the screen, in the description down below, and more videos anytime on the channel page. And until the next time, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you next time.